Well, first of all, it's my personal honor to have, be able to invite Professor Anuj Karpatne, well, sorry for this talk. And Anuj is an assistant professor in Virginia Tech, and he is actually one of the leading figures in physics guided or science guided machine learning. And I know him from NS Idea Labs, the discussions, and he was just one of the leading figures. So today we are looking forward to his talk on physics guided machine learning.
All right. Thank you so much, Frank, for the wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions on how we can take this area forward in the application that you're working on. So, Frank, should I start sharing my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
So are you giving the permission? Yes, already.
Let me start the slideshow. And Frank, how much time do I have for the talk?
Disha, I think you can get to 320. Oh, no, I'm sorry. At 125.
Sure. All right, yeah. I'll calibrate my talk accordingly. All right, so it's a pleasure to be here, and I work in the area of machine learning, data mining. I'm an assistant professor in computer science here at Virginia Tech, and the focus of our research group is on advancing this paradigm of science-guided or physics-guided machine learning. So in the talk today, I'll provide a high-level overview of first, why do we need to integrate scientific knowledge in machine learning methods? We'll go through the high-level overview of what is science-guided machine learning, what are the different research themes that are being explored in the scientific and engineering communities. And then we'll talk about some case studies to illustrate these research themes using illustrative examples of the work that we are doing in our group. Right. So let me start with the motivation, right? Why do we need to guide machine learning using science? So I think we are, let me just, yeah. Yeah. So we are all aware of the deluge of data that we are facing in almost every scientific and engineering discipline. We have new and improved data about human health and well-being. For example, for COVID-19 forecasting, we have a lot of data about social networks. We have a lot of data in scientific fields, either through outputs from high throughput experiments, through field-based surveys, or through simulations of these physics-based or theory-based models in different communities. Right? And this deluge of data is what has powered many advances in the field of machine learning or data analytics or artificial intelligence, right? The most recent advances being in the field of deep learning that have led to remarkable success stories in a number of commercial applications. Right? These are systems that can sift through large volumes of data and are behind systems that recommend you friends on Facebook or recommends you movies, products, many other such services. Right? So given all of these accomplishments of machine learning methods in commercial applications, it is befitting to ask whether these machine learning advances can also be useful in scientific applications to accelerate scientific discoveries. Right? So this is a theme that is catching a lot of interest in the scientific communities that is highlighted by a series of special issues in leading journals like Nature and Science on big data, on AI methods, transforming science. And this in the hyperbole of the excitement in machine learning, there is an extreme view of of that is referred to as the end of theory, right? Where the basic argument is that if we have ample data, can we completely embrace the information contained in data um, to understand scientific processes and let go of the existing theory-based or physics-based or data or science-based models that have been the cornerstone of progress in many scientific and engineering communities, right? So this is embracing the black box nature of machine learning, which are um, developed and deployed in a manner agnostic to the underlying scientific theories, right? So um, unfortunately, what we observe is in many scientific applications, such tall claims of black box methods replacing the scientific method fails in practice, right? And there are several reasons why this is happening. Why scientific applications are special. Um, Two of those reasons are highlighted right over here. The first reason is the amount of data that we have in many scientific applications is of a very different scale than what we may have in commercial applications. For example, in computer vision, text translation, we have billions or sometimes even trillions of labeled data examples, right? And the availability of large scale labeled data is one of the factors that have accelerated progress in artificial intelligence methods, in machine learning methods. Right? These methods are quite data hungry. And when you apply them on small data problems that we encounter in many scientific applications, there are several risks involved, right? Especially when your training data is not representative enough of the distributions in the test set, right? It is highly likely that your model can learn spurious solutions that may be misleading, right? Even if you look at both the training and validation errors, if the distribution of the data is changing over time, um, the black box machine learning methods can have a hard time. Another limiting factor of black box machine learning is that in many scientific applications, we are looking at a different end goal, which is even if we are able to get good predictive performance, in many scientific applications, we really want to get to the explanations of the scientific processes, right? To descriptive insights of the phenomena that we are studying, right? So for that reason, we really want to open the black box of machine learning so that we are not only providing better predictions, but we are also doing so in a manner that is consistent with existing scientific theories, so that the new models that we generate from machine learning can be explained, can be interpreted by domain scientists, and can be used as building blocks of scientific progress. So this is just a high-level overview of why we want to move beyond black box learning. And to understand the dichotomy between black box models and physics-based or science-based models, we can look at this 2D view, where on the x-axis, we are looking at the amount of data that is used by a model, and the amount of scientific knowledge that is used by a model is on the y-axis, right? In this abstract 2D space, science-based models would reside in this particular subspace that make ample use of scientific knowledge available in different forms in different disciplines. Like we may have partial differential equations, eigenvalue equations, closed form equations, or we may have simulations of numerical models, right? And while these models are anchored in scientific theories, they make limited use of data beyond standard methods such as model calibration and data assimilation that do not change the functional forms of the model itself, right? We can estimate the parameters, the hidden variables better. And they have their own set of limitations, right? Because in many real world applications, many of these models are heavily over parameterized, right? Where finding the right set of parameters is a challenge in itself. Right? And in many applications, we may have incomplete or missing representations of the physics that are encoded in these models, either for computational reasons, so that the models are scalable to real world settings, or because we may have incomplete knowledge of the process that we are observing. Okay? So these are some of the challenges with science-based models. On the other end of the spectrum, we have these black box machine learning methods that can make effective use of large volumes of data, but are not tied to any underlying scientific theories. Right? And we have already went through the challenges with black box learning. Right? So in this 2D view, it's easy to see that both these classes of models are making ineffective use of the two sources of information that we have here, which is data and scientific knowledge. Right? And there is an opportunity to develop methods in this particular space that use both the data and knowledge at an equal footing. Right? This is at a very high level the goal of the paradigm of science-guided machine learning, where we want to make full advantage of the unique ability of data science methods to automatically extract patterns and models from the data, but without ignoring the treasure of knowledge accumulated in scientific theories. Right? This area of research, right, is referred to by different names in different communities. Right? So here is just a list of synonymous names that you may come across in different works. For example, knowledge-guided machine learning, physics-guided machine learning, physics-informed machine learning, and so on and so forth. Right? So, um, so in all of these terminologies, right, the word science is being used quite loosely, which is to refer to any form of knowledge that we have about the problem that we are trying to study. And in this talk, I'll be using the terms science-guided and physics-guided quite interchangeably. So this area of science-guided machine learning is just in the last 2 or 3 years has gained a lot of attention in the scientific engineering and machine learning communities. That is highlighted by a series of um, uh, workshops, symposiums, thought papers, survey articles, calls from funding agencies along the lines of integrating scientific knowledge or physics with machine learning methods. Right? Um, for example, one of the workshops that we organized last year as part of the Triple AI Fall Symposium series was on physics-guided AI, right, that helped to bring researchers from different communities that are working at the intersections of physics and machine learning. So this just shows you the excitement in the field. Just last year, there was a survey paper on the topic of physics-guided machine learning that covers more than 300 papers that have been published just in the last 3 years. So this shows you how the community is rapidly growing. And with that high-level motivation, let's take a step deeper into the different research themes that are being explored in this area. And it will be great to explore how these different research themes of science-guided machine learning apply to your own problems. Right? So at a very high level, we can look at two guiding principles of the research in SGML. The first guiding theme is how can scientific knowledge help machine learning? And the other side of the coin is how can machine learning advance scientific knowledge? Right? So on the first side of the coin, we want to use scientific knowledge to improve the performance of the current state of deep learning machine learning models. Right? Now the question is, why do we want to use science or scientific knowledge for this purpose? Right? So as we just discussed, uh, when the amount of data that we have is limited in size or limited in representative power, right? It is difficult to ensure the generalization performance of black box machine learning models. Right? And in those problems, scientific knowledge can appear as another form of supervision to guide the learning of machine learning models to more scientifically consistent models and hopefully better generalization performance. Right? So this is looking at this popular trade-off between the two competing objectives that we have in any machine learning formulation, which is that we want to minimize the training errors, and we also want to ensure that our models are not overly complex. Right? So this is at the heart of several machine learning algorithms and statistical theories like bias variance trade-off or the Occam's razor from a philosophical perspective, that we want to balance the complexity of the model rooted in statistical norms and the empirical risk or empirical performance of the model on the given data. Right? In scientific applications, we have another source of information, which is whether my models are being consistent with known scientific equations or not. Right? So I can look at all of the violations of a model's predictions with scientific equations and use that as another surrogate of generalization performance. Right? So in this particular guiding principle, we are adding scientific inconsistency as another pillar of generalization performance. Right? And this can be achieved in several ways. Two of the research themes that the community is exploring are as follows. So the first theme is on changing the architecture itself of machine learning methods like neural networks, so that these architectures are not only determined from data or determined using ad hoc approaches, like we can add as many layers of neurons and see if our training or validation performance is improving. But uh, along with that, we can also make sure that our architecture embeds or hard codes the physics of the problem, right? So there are several ways this can be done by incorporating symmetries or intermediate variables in our neural network design. The other direction or research theme is to change the learning algorithm, right? So when we are training our neural network, when we are performing the optimization, um, we are generally making a trade-off between training errors and model complexity, as we just discussed. But along with that, can we also add other loss terms in the learning objective that favor the selection of physically consistent models, right? So this would help us steer away from spurious solutions towards more scientifically consistent and generalizable solutions. Right? So I'm just providing a high-level overview of the different research themes. Very soon we'll do some deep dives into these different research themes using specific case studies. If we look at the second side of the coin of SGML, we can ask the question, how can machine learning advance scientific knowledge? Right? And this can be done in several ways. For example, by discovering the equations or the laws governing the real world phenomena directly from the data, right? So this involves techniques like symbolic regression and other such approaches. Or given the functional forms of the relationships between the inputs and outputs, perhaps we can use machine learning methods to only estimate the parameters or the state variables in these physics-based models. Right? So that's another research theme. The final research theme is on constructing these hybrid science ML models, where you're looking at a physics-based or theory-based model of a scientific complex system, where you know that certain components of the model are deficient. Right? So what if we can augment or replace certain components of a physics-based model using machine learning methods? Right? Or what if we can identify systematic biases in the outputs of a physics-based model and correct those biases using machine learning methods, right? So this is where both machine learning methods and scientific models are working hand in hand. Right? So these are just is a very high-level overview of the different research themes in science-guided machine learning. what I'll do next is perhaps provide a snapshot of research covering different research themes of science-guided machine learning. And they are all developed in the context of different applications um, in collaboration with domain experts from different institutions. Right. So we'll be talking about 5 different case studies that will illustrate the nature of research happening in these different research themes of SGML. All right. So let's dive into our first case study, which is on modeling the temperature of water in lakes using science-guided learning methods. Right. So we are trying to model the temperature of water in a lake across the depth of the lake and across time. And we know that this output variable is dependent on several input factors, such as the amount of radiation that reaches the surface of the water, the air temperature, wind speed, all of which are available to us as input drivers. Right? And the simplest approach to map these inputs X to the outputs Y is to use a physics-based model, for example, the state-of-the-art general lake model or GLM, right? But we asked the question: can we build a machine learning model to do the same job, to map X to Y, right? And we can do that using the data that we have, observations of both X and Y, and the knowledge of the physical relationships between the target variable, which is the temperature, and other physical variables, right? For example, we know that the temperature of water is directly related to the depth, to the density of the water, right? Because density of the water is maximum at 4 degrees Celsius, assuming no salinity, and the density would decrease as we go away from 4 degrees, right? So we know the relationship between temperature and density in turn is related to the depth of the water, because denser water goes down to the bottom of the lake, and hence you would always experience a monotonic relationship between density and depth. Okay? So this is what we are referring to as the density depth physics. Right? There are many other forms of physics that we know about lake temperature dynamics. Right? For example, we know that the principle of energy conservation should hold. As we are looking at temperature predictions across time, we know that the energy should be conserved. So these are just some examples of the physics relationships that we know should always hold between the output variable Y, the temperature, and other physics variables. With that knowledge, we are looking at a revised learning objective of machine learning methods, where we are looking at the empirical risk of our model, which is how close are my predictions by hat with respect to the ground truth. We are looking at statistical norms of model complexity, right? And along with these 2 pillars, we are adding the third pillar of scientific consistency, right? So along with ensuring that my prediction errors are small and my model is less complex, can I also ensure that my model predictions Y hat comply with these known physical relationships? For example, the density depth physics or the energy conservation. For every such physical relationship, I can construct a loss function, which I'll refer to as the physics-guided loss, and add that to the learning objective using some trade-off parameter lambda physics. Okay? So the details are in the paper on how we can construct different loss functions for different types of relationships. But this is the general recipe or the general formula that we can invoke when we are looking at science-guided learning problems. Okay? The advantage of adding physics laws is that it can, of course, help us achieve more scientifically consistent solutions, right? But another advantage is that while the prediction loss requires ground truth, right, and hence can only be evaluated on the labeled examples, which we'll refer to as DTR, right, which can be limited in many real-world applications. Science-guided or physics-guided loss functions do not require ground truth, right? Given a model, a neural network model, you can obtain its predictions even on unlabeled data samples, DU, which can be ample in many applications. And looking at those model predictions, you can infer whether those predictions are violating physical rules or not, right? So this is one way we can circumvent the challenge of paucity of labels that plagues black box machine learning methods. If we talk about the recent progress that has been made in this area of science-guided learning, we have observed several advantages of this this uh, this theme of research on physics-guided neural networks, or PGNNs, especially in the area of lake temperature modeling, where we have observed that we can achieve much better generalization performance even with very small amount of training labels, DTR, right? With just 10 training examples, what we can show is that our performance is at par uh, as a black box model trained over 1,000 training samples, right? So this is getting to the label efficiency of machine learning methods. What we are also able to see is that it's able to generalize better to novel testing scenarios, right? So this is getting to the out of distribution testing. What if we train a model on lakes in a certain ecosystem and then test the model on lakes in a different ecosystem, right? For example, if we train our model on lakes in Texas and apply them on lakes in Minnesota that have a um, different dynamics of temperature variations, what we see is that by anchoring our models with physics laws, we can achieve better generalization performance even on novel testing scenarios. Right? So um, this is at the heart of several evaluation techniques that we are exploring in the area of science-guided learning. And of course, we can ensure better physical consistency of the outputs as well. Right? So in the last few years, there has been the huge volume of work that has been explored on constructing different types of physics-guided loss functions to capture different physical relationships in different applications. A seminal work in this area is that of physics-informed neural networks, right, which is developed to solve partial differential equations, where we are looking at um, inconsistencies or residuals of our model predictions with respect to PD equations, and that is being minimized as a physics-guided loss. Right? And PINNs take the idea of science-guided learning to the next level, or to the next extreme, by exploring label-free learning methods, right? So for black box learning, um, we only care about the prediction loss, right? And do not look at physics-guided loss. On the other extreme, PINNs look at a situation where we can completely get rid of labeled examples and only train on physics-guided loss functions, right? So this is label-free learning. So given all of this progress that we have made in science-guided learning, the question that we can ask is this a solved area of research, or are there some open questions that we still need to explore, right? So one of the questions that we are exploring is um, can we completely embrace label-free learning? So these are some of the open questions that we are exploring. Um, that can we completely get rid of training labels and only focus on physics-guided loss? Right? What we have observed in many real-world applications is that you really need a trade-off between both these loss terms to ensure better generalization performance. Right? Another question that we can ask is, um, if we want to ensure generalization performance on novel testing scenarios, right? How different should the labeled and unlabeled sets be, right? What if DU is equal to DTR, right? Would it have similar performance or not? Another question that we can ask is, how should we treat this trade-off parameter lambda physics, right? Should we use a constant value of the lambda physics, which means that we would be paying equal importance to the physics-guided loss at different stages of learning, right? At different epochs of the gradient descent, right? Or um, there are situations where we need to pay differential importance to the physics-guided laws at different stages of neural network learning. An even more challenging question is, how do we handle multiple physics-guided loss functions, right? What if we have multiple physics objectives that we want to comply with, where these different physics objectives may have competing gradients, right? So when we have competition among the different physics laws terms, how can we play that competition so that we can achieve better generalization performance, right? So these are just some of the open questions that we are still exploring as a community. And I'll describe all of these open questions in the second case study, which is in the context of quantum mechanics problems. So we are looking at a very simple problem of an Ising chain model where we have um, a, a system of n particles, uh, which is experiencing an external magnetic field Bx. And we want to study how the system behaves as we change this magnetic field Bx. Right? So this can be framed as an eigenvalue equation, right? Because to study the system, we really want to get to the wave function psi, right? Which can be obtained by solving the Schrodinger's equation, which is basically an eigenvalue equation, where the Hamiltonian, the matrix, is dependent on the magnetic field, right? So for different values of Bx, we will have different Hamiltonian matrices. And for every Hamiltonian matrix, we want to get to its wave functions, right? And actually, we want to get to the wave function that has the lowest energy, right? So we want to get to that psi that has the lowest eigenvalue, right? Now, from the perspective of supervised machine learning, we can frame this problem as that of training a neural network that takes the Hamiltonian matrix as an input and predicts the wave function as an output, right? The ground state wave function. And to solve this problem, we can again summon the formula for science-guided learning, where we have the prediction loss, regularization terms, and the loss corresponding to physical consistencies, right? But for this problem, we don't have one, but we have two different loss terms, right? First, we want to make sure that our wave function predictions, psi hat, satisfy the eigenvalue equation, right? So that is what we are referring to as the Schrodinger loss or the S loss. And we also want to ensure that our uh, wave function that we are predicting corresponds to the lowest energy, right? So we also want to minimize the energy, which we are referring to as the E loss, right? So a naive approach to minimize both these loss terms is to add them using constant trade-off parameters, right? Some lambda physics terms for both S loss and E loss, and hope that this addition to the learning objective should steer the training dynamics to a solution that satisfies both these objectives. Right? What we really find in practice, and this applies to many multi-physics problems, is that when you have multiple physics objectives that you're trying to comply with, um, different physics objectives can have uh, different directions of gradient descent. And just by adding them together, you can easily end up at local minima solutions, right? So, for example, here is just a toy demonstration of a situation where we have two different physics objectives. The objective two is much smoother, whereas objective one has more ups and downs. And we can see that if we perform gradient descent by adding these two objectives together, it's easy to get stuck at any of these local minima solutions of the first physics objective, right? Whereas to get to the global minima, we actually want to pay importance to the physics objective one only when we are close to a good enough solution of objective two, right? So this is the key idea that we are exploring, which is can we, instead of using constant trade-off parameters for different physics objectives, can we adaptively tune the importance of S loss and D loss at different stages or epochs of neural network learning, right? Perhaps we want to pay more emphasis to smoothly varying objectives, which happens to be the energy loss in our case. Um, and when we are close to a good enough solution of the energy loss, perhaps that is when we want to trigger the first physics objective, which has sharper gradients. So this is the crux of the solution that we have developed, which is very specific to the Schrodinger equation that we're trying to solve. We are referring to this as the competing physics objectives PGNN, or the coffee PGNN. And I'll not go into the details of the exact formulation, but the basic idea is to adaptively tune S loss and E loss. This is one theme of research that we have explored in the area of science-guided learning, right? Which is how do you explore the interplay between different physics laws and data loss terms. Let me move to another case study, which is looking at a different research theme of science-guided learning, which is looking at science-guided architectures, right? So instead of only modifying the learning scheme, can we in fact modify the architecture itself such that the physics is directly embedded or hard-coded or baked in the way the layers are arranged in the neural network, or in the way the neurons are interacting with each other, right? This is really important when we want to make sure that our models have good physical consistency, not only during the training stage, but even during the testing stage, right? So once we have built our model, and when we are applying this model now on the test instances, how can we make sure that our model predictions are still physically consistent, right? If we have hard-coded physics in the architecture itself, right, in the connections between the layers, and in the interpretations of different neurons in the intermediate layers, we can hope that the neural network would remain to be physically consistent even during the testing stage, right? And this is really important, especially when we are looking at uncertainty quantification problems. For example, when we apply Monte Carlo dropout methods, where we are introducing minor perturbations to the neural network weights, and for every perturbation, we are generating a different sample of the output, right? Now, what happens when we do these perturbations to the weights is that even if the model is trained using physics loss functions during training, during testing, when we introduce these minor perturbations, the model can be completely thrown off to becoming physically inconsistent, right? So this is a motivation for why we want to look at science-guided architectures. And for the problem of lake modeling, this boils down to the question that can we hard code the physical relationships like the density depth physics in the neural network construction itself, right? So for this research theme, we have developed a physics-guided architecture of LSTM models, which we're referring to as the PGA LSTM model, where the basic idea is that in order to predict the target variable temperature, we first want to predict some useful intermediate variables, for example, the density of the water, right? Because we know that density of water is directly related to the temperature of water. And second, we want to look at the relationships between the density of water at different depth values, and encode the physics consistency relationships, which is that the density should monotonically increase with depth, as physics informed connections among the different LSTM nodes, right? So we are looking at the depth sequence, and we are trying to ensure that the recurrence relationships between the different depth values satisfies the density depth physics, right? So the details are in the paper, but we are essentially looking at the LSTM architecture shown in black, in all of the black and all of the red boxes and arrows show the architectural modifications that we have made so that our model captures the monotonic constraints between density and depth. And if we look at the results of this particular architecture for a particular lake in Wisconsin, on a given date, we can see that the samples that we are obtaining on this given date from the PGA LSTM, right, after performing Monte Carlo dropout, are all complying with the density depth physics that each sample has a monotonic trend between temperature and the depth. Right? Whereas for the other baseline methods, right, even if we use physics-guided loss functions during the training of these models, when we apply Monte Carlo dropout, these samples can be highly physically inconsistent. Right? The temperature can go up and down as we increase the depth, which is not physically meaningful. Right? So this was one application where we explored physics-guided architectures. Let's move on to another case study in a different application domain, where we are again looking at the principle of embedding our physical knowledge in the construction of neural networks itself. So this is a problem in fluid dynamics where we are looking at multi-phase flows. We are looking at particles, solid particles suspended in a moving fluid. And the goal of this project is to estimate the drag forces experienced by every particle in this fluid. Right? So one approach to solve this is to look at fine scale simulations of the different pressure and velocity fields around the particles. Right? And once we have that, we can easily integrate these fields along the surface of the particles to compute the drag forces. Right? Now, this is an accurate approach, but this is quite expensive. Right? Another approach is to use coarse scale simulations where we can treat every particle as a point object. And we can estimate the drag forces at an aggregate level for a collection of particles instead of individual particles. Right? So this is much faster than performing fine scale simulations, but this doesn't have the complete information. Right? It's only able to predict things at the level of collections of particles. So the question that we explored in this project is, can we use the outputs from coarse scale simulations? Can we use information of the positions of the particles only, feed that to a neural network model that can predict the drag forces on individual particles? Right? And while doing so, can we make sure that our neural network model expresses physically meaningful quantities? Right? For example, to predict drag force, we know that some of the useful intermediate variables are the pressure and velocity fields around the particles. Right? So can we hinge some of the hidden layers of our neural network to express pressure and velocity fields? This is the basic idea of another work that we developed for drag force estimation, which is referred to as the FiNet model, which is a physics-guided neural network architecture, where we start from the positions of these particles, and we have several neural network layers that help us predict the drag force. But while doing so, we hinge some of these layers shown in red to express physically meaningful quantities like the pressure and velocity fields, or the different components, the pressure and shear components of the drag force. Right? And what we are able to show is that by hinging some of these hidden layers to physical intermediate variables, we are able to achieve better generalization performance on the output task of drag force prediction. Right? So these were just some illustrations of research themes in the area of science-guided machine learning, and we look at different applications in physical applications. Now, this last and final case study moves beyond physics to applications in biology, where we are looking at scientific knowledge available in very different forms, in the forms of phylogenetic trees and anatomy ontologies, right? So for this particular problem, we are looking at images of fish species, and we want to perform a series of tasks. For example, looking at an image of a fish, we want to classify the species of the fish, or we want to annotate the different parts of the fish, right? Which is where the fins are located, where the eye is located, and so on and so forth, right? So these can be translated as classification or segmentation problems. But the challenge here is that the number of labeled examples that we have is very limited, right? We are collecting images from different museums across the country, and the diversity of fish images that we would be observing out in the wild, in the lakes, would be much higher than what we would observe in the museums, right? So the question we would ask here is, to build these neural networks for classification and segmentation, how can we make use of the biological knowledge, right? For example, the phylogenetic information between the different species, or knowledge graphs or ontologies of how different traits are related. So for example, one of the research themes we explored in this particular project is for species classification, that we take an input of a fish and we want to predict the species class. But we know that the species are not independent of each other, right? There is a hierarchical structure among the relationships between the different species, right? For example, different species are clubbed into the genus, different genus can be clubbed to a family, and so on and so forth, right? So can we develop a neural network architecture where the hierarchy of the layers expresses the hierarchy in the phylogenetic tree? This is the key idea that we explored for our hierarchy guided neural networks approach, where we would enforce certain layers of our neural network architecture to express code scale labels like the genus class. What we observe is that by introducing this phylogenetic information, we can achieve better generalization performance. Our test performance is better than black box architectures. But we want to take the next step of not only looking at predictive performance, but even understanding why the neural networks are classifying a particular image to a certain class, right? So we want to look at these maps, which are referred to as saliency maps, which are basically showing the importance of the different regions of the input image that the neural network identifies to be useful for predicting this image to a certain class, right? So all of the regions that are white reflect that the neural network is paying more importance to those regions, right? So this is getting to the interpretability aspect of deep learning. And by looking at these saliency maps, we came to know of a very interesting result of science-guided machine learning, which is that by anchoring these architectures with scientific knowledge, we can achieve better robustness to adversarial attacks, right? This is a problem that that is very critical in many safety applications of machine learning methods. For example, in computer vision, where you can introduce some adversarial perturbations or noise to your input images that may not be visually discernible, but for a classification algorithm, for a deep learning model, it may be sufficient to completely change the classification probabilities to a different class, right? So this is what is known as adversarial attacks. In our problem, we wanted to look at a very simple attack procedure where we would occlude certain regions of the input image that have high contributions to the saliency map, right? For example, if we take this particular image, right, we can look at the predictions of the black box model and the BGN model, and we are looking at the probabilities for 10 different classes, right? We know that the first class over here is the correct class. Right? So we can see that both the models have identified the first class to be the correct class with the highest probability. But what if I occlude a certain region of the input image that has the highest contribution to the saliency map, right? Which is right over here, right? Because we see that these pixels have higher saliency values, right? Um, if we do that, we see that the black box model now has its probabilities all over the place. It still is able to identify the first class with the highest probability, right? But if we perform another level of adversarial occlusion, right? If we incrementally keep on starving information from the input image by placing these patches and hiding information that the neural network thinks is very important, in just 2 steps, what we will see is that the black box model has probabilities all over the place, and now it has uh, identified the third class, right, to have the highest probability, right? Whereas the BGNN model, the biology guided neural network model, has a lower probability for the correct class, right? So it's also impacted by adversarial occlusions, but the scale of the impact is much lower, right? It is still able to identify the correct class, right? So this shows a very interesting aspect of evaluation, which is that by introducing physics or science, we can ensure that our models are also robust to adversarial occlusions. There are many research themes that we are exploring in this project, which is funded by one of the NSF Ideas Labs projects. We are currently working on introducing ontologies among the different anatomical shapes as another form of supervision to guide neural networks. In the interest of time, let me quickly go through some other case studies that we are currently actively working on. We're looking at problems in mechanobiology, where we're looking at the motion of cells inside fibrous environments inside the human body, and we are looking at how can we track them with the knowledge of the mechanical forces between the cells and the fibrous environments. We are looking at uh, problems in quantum physics, optics, and radar physics as part of an NSF with grant. We are looking at inverse modeling problems for retrieving aerosol properties given optical measurements from the ground. And in another project, we are looking at material science problems. We are trying to predict the profile of cracks that would appear using physics-guided neural network architectures, right? So this is just a very high-level summary of these case studies. I'll be happy to talk about any of one of these problems in more detail. With that, let me summarize what we discussed today. We looked at different case studies that highlight different research themes in science-guided machine learning. We looked at different forms of scientific knowledge that are being explored, ranging from first principle equations to model simulations to ontologies. We looked at different ways of incorporating the scientific knowledge with machine learning methods in the context of different application domains. Here are some of the activities that are happening in science-guided machine learning that you can contribute towards. We are organizing another symposium in the AAAI Spring Symposium series on machine learning for physical sciences. And we are also working towards a contributed book on SGML, which should be out in August of this year. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge the funding agencies. I'd like to thank the wonderful set of collaborators who are providing the expertise from the domain side on all of these problems, and the amazing set of students in my group who are behind all of the work that I described today. So thank you, everyone, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Anu. Yeah. So to the audience, is there any questions? Ali?
Yes. So you work in a lot of different areas, and with collaborators. So could you say a little bit about your interdisciplinary mode, the way you work with your interdisciplinary collaborators?
Sure. I think it's a great learning experience working with researchers from different backgrounds, because we can try to read papers in different areas. So I'm a computer scientist. I do not have background in any of the problems that I'm looking at, right? But and I can try to read papers in the different communities, but but it's a whole different game when I'm actually talking to these collaborators, who can provide the expertise on how to treat the data sets, where to get the data sets, how to understand the physics or the science behind the problem. So I think I've been fortunate to have a great set of collaborators who are equally excited about science-guided machine learning. I think none of these projects would have been possible working in silos. Right, so that's something that I'm also encouraging my students to follow, to build interdisciplinary collaborations, because none of this research could be possible without it.
So do you meet regularly with your collaborators? Do you by email?
Sure,
Yeah,
so
and just kind of get a sense of how you work with these interdisciplinary people.
Sure. So I think the usual trajectory for many of these problems is we first have the ideation phase, or we are brainstorming ideas together, and we then carve out a very simple canonical problem in a particular domain. Like, for example, in the quantum mechanics problem, we just thought of a very simple four-spin system to solve. We get the data, and we perform some exploratory analysis of machine learning methods, look at the results together. And we have regular meetings, bi-weekly meetings generally for many of these projects. So the domain experts are involved at every stage in the generation of data, in the analysis of data. And for many of these problems, actually, the way it has happened is that we would show them some results, and we would say that things are looking good, but there are some problems, but I think that's okay. And then the collaborators would say that, okay, this is exactly what we can do to improve the results. Right? So I think it's a lot of back and forth, and we try to meet bi-weekly on many of our projects.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Other questions? So, maybe you can answer my question. So, in your this physics loss, that term, and you have the strength or regression strength, how do you determine what kind of strength you use? If you put too much, then it is going to hurt.
That's a very good question, right? So let me just share my screen and get to that part that you were asking about. So if I go back to the basic formula, right, this particular formula that we talked about, the real challenge is on finding this trade-off parameter lambda physics, right? Which is how hard or how soft do you want to consider your physical equations, right? If you know that your physics holds perfectly well, for example, the Schrodinger's equation or the Navier-Stokes equation, then you can be confident with the physics and have large values of lambda physics, right? When you have equations that that may sometimes be violated, then you want to use them in a softer way by using smaller values of lambda physics. So lambda physics is basically like a trade-off parameter that helps us balance the importance of the physics laws in relationship to the prediction laws. I think what we are exploring in our research is getting to the right lambda physics is definitely a research direction that requires a lot of work. Because in many applications, using the constant lambda physics may not be useful. So the physics laws may have different importances at different stages of the learning. And this is where I think there's a lot of potential for exciting research.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Well, if you have other questions, you are also welcome to stay a little longer. I requested to Anu that we want I request for additional 10 minutes after this talk, but this talk is over, and if you would like to stay with me, I do have some more technical questions to ask. And if you would like to join me to stay, feel free to stay. And let's thank the speaker.
Thank you everyone for attending the talk, and I'll be happy to answer any questions over email if you have any.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. It's a pleasure.